All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome very much to this evening's event with Philip Zelikow to discuss his co-authored with Condoleezza Rice's new book, To Build a Better World. This is, as those of you who have been following our events will know, sort of the second in a pair of talks that the History and International Security series here at the American Grand Strategy Program, which I direct, has hosted on, or rather commemorating German unification or reunification, whatever semantic variation you prefer. And today it's really wonderful to have one of the central policymakers in that process, Philip Zelikow, here with us to share some historical insight and perhaps some thoughts on more contemporary issues as well. Before I introduce Philip, I just want to note that this is actually the last event of our semester here at the American Grand Strategy Program. So whereas normally I would kind of give you a little rundown of what's to come in the impending weeks, I won't. Which will probably be a nice break for you as it is for me. But I will say, if you are not yet on our listserv, I would encourage you to visit ags.duke.edu to get signed up. And also, if you are able to make this, but you haven't been able to make a past event, most of those are available on the AGS website as well, recorded, so you can watch them from the comfort of your home and the convenience of your own time choices. But we're here today to speak with Philip Zelikow, the author of this great book, To Build a Better World. His career has straddled history as an academic discipline and, of course, making history as a policymaker, including time as the counselor to the Secretary of State during the tenure of Condoleezza Rice, his co-author, as executive director of the 9/11 Commission during the George W. Bush administration, and of course, on the National Security Council staff during the term of George H.W. Bush. And I think it's correct to say, Philip, that you've served under every president from Reagan through to up to and including Obama, with a gap for the last 4 years. And certainly an outspoken voice, a very valuable voice during those 4 years as well on national security issues. And also, I must say, a professor of history and of government at the University of Virginia. And while normally we would have loved to have asked you to have made the drive down for this time, Zoom will have to do. So welcome to you, Philip, and thank you for making the time to be with us.
I'm glad to be with you. And I'm very pleasantly surprised to see that at least 60 students are ruining their evenings by turning on Zoom during what almost amounts to their prime time. So thank you for tuning in.
Well, let me start by asking you a question about the book. So in a sense, this is a second edition, right? You and Secretary Rice wrote a first version of this book, which I believe was published in 1995, covering the events of German reunification and the construction of a post-Cold War era in Europe. And I'm wondering why now, or recently, as books take time to come out and come together, why you wanted to revisit this topic with a fresh lens. Is there something about this historical moment that got you both thinking that it was time to reopen that era for some new inquiry?
Yeah, actually, we didn't think of it as a second edition. We thought actually that we needed to broaden the lens and write a much more ambitious book than our first book had been. Our first book was an international history of the of German unification, that we had unusual access to the American sources, and then we extended from that through our language abilities to do everything in German and Russian sources as well, and try to tell that as international history centered on German unification. What we've done here is broaden it out and try to tell an international history of this entire period, really kicking off in the late 1970s and mainly ending in the early 1990s, but even with a chapter that draws the story forward to the present day. And here's why. We believe the world is drifting towards another major systemic crisis, global systemic crisis. So we argue that over the last, say, 300 years, the world has had 5 such systemic crises before, 5 in 300 years. 4 of them were marked by catastrophic wars on global scale. 1 of them was resolved and the system was reordered more or less peacefully, 1 out of the 5. Since we're headed towards another possible grand crisis, we thought it was a good idea to tell the story of the 1. That it was a good idea to remind people of how we got through a global systemic crisis without a cataclysmic war. That maybe it was timely now to remind people of that story, because I actually do think that in this period, we're going to need to try to reboot the global system around a new series of problems and with new institutions. And most people, I think, actually do not really understand what actually happened in the late 80s and early 90s. They understand little pieces of it, like especially the crisis of communism and Gorbachev. There is a literature about some of the German unification piece and Eastern European unrest. Not so much on the China side, actually. And after that, it mostly is just a blur. Actually, people think that the institutions we're fighting over now are the institutions created after 1945. In fact, the institutions of that era were either completely transformed in this period or entirely new institutions were created. We're not fighting over the world order of 1950. We're not fighting over the Cold War order. We're fighting over the future of the global commonwealth that was created in the early 90s.
So when we think to the late phase of the Cold War international system, and that's a cumbersome term, but it works, or at least it works as well as any alternative I've encountered. I wonder if you could give us a little sense about the role of Germany, because when I teach Cold War history in 2020, students often think, why is Germany such a big deal? It's a very agreeable country. That very nice lady is in charge. It seems great. Could you give us some perspective from the point of view of someone who was actively involved? What was the role, the significance, and the stakes of Germany in thinking about the Cold War?
Here's a very good illustration. Question: why was Pennsylvania so important last week? There are 50 states. Why was Pennsylvania so important? There are even states that are bigger than Pennsylvania. Answer: why? Because in the peculiar circumstances of America in 2020, it was a swing state. It was one of a handful of swing states that would determine the future of the whole country. That's the answer to your question about why is Germany so important. And in just the era you're talking about, Simon, the late Cold War era, which I would kind of date as from about the mid 1970s to the late 1980s, say 75 to 88, 78 to 88. In a way, the Cold War is not being decided in this period by what happens in the United States and whether or not we go communist or we go socialist. There's no danger the United States will go socialist. Ask yourself, if this is a global election between confidence in capitalism or confidence in socialism, a global election, where are the swing states in that election? My answer is Western and Central Europe, Northeast Asia. So it really matters that China makes the choices China makes at the end of the 1970s and early 1980s. And it really matters, above all, that France and Germany make certain choices in the late 1970s and early 1980s, away from socialism, with a revived confidence in capitalism and a renewal of anti-communism. That sets this, and that frames the stage then for the crisis of communism that becomes palpable in the middle and late 1980s. But from a world history point of view, therefore, the Chinese and Europeans are very important, which then tells you something about our book. Our book is not, our book has a lot about America in it, but it also has a lot in it about Europe. And there are European protagonists and occasionally even Chinese and Soviet protagonists. Because it's like an ensemble play where in different acts of the play, different actors play a more prominent role. In some acts, the United States plays a central role, but in other acts, it's really the Europeans who are playing the dominant driving role, or in this act, it might be the Soviet leader, etc. So you need a world perspective to understand this world historical period. And that's the broad lens that we were trying to use in writing this book, about this turn in the whole global system.
And I think your point about the importance of non-American actors is so valuable, especially coming from someone who was an American actor in this process. It's always, I think, or it is occasionally a bit of an uphill battle to help students in the United States recognize the centrality of others in shaping big international policy questions.
Can I interject something on that, Simon?
Yeah, sure.
Because maybe your students are a little, and some of the students tuned in here are a little bit like some of my UVA students. The Americans always tend to put America at the center of every story. By the way, they do this whether America is the hero or the villain. Actually, usually in college campuses, it's the villain. But we're always at the center. We're always the subject, and other countries are the helpless object or victims. Usually it's not a hero narrative. Usually it's a villain narrative. But we're always at the center. The argument I make to them is you need to decenter America in order to see America. Mm-hmm. If you run the story not as an American story and then like how do others play in America's story, run it as the story of the country you're interested or the region you're interested in. Work that history, decentering America. Then ask the question, how did America figure in this story, in their story? And how did America make a difference in their story? And how might it have done more or less in their story? You'll actually get a much better view of what the important American choices were.
I endorse that wholeheartedly. I think that's the value of international history, the kind that the two of you do in this book, is to say, okay, if we only have one, if we have a cast of characters of one, then it's inevitable that that character is the star. But if we open ourselves up to a big, more complicated, tougher to track down range of characters, then we can actually identify who the leading figure is and who is actually just sort of off in the wings, attendant number 3, as you might be credited in a high school play. So I love that point, and I think it's one of the many strengths of this book is that you don't make yourselves always the stars of the story, though of course both of you have really important roles, and thus and that's I think a lot of the value for someone like me who's consuming this as history. Is that sense of proportion and perspective that the authors bring bring to their work.
Well, and this is another reason, Simon, why we wanted to revisit the story, is frankly, we learned a lot more about the others. If I was criticizing my earlier book, the 1995 book, I would say, I think, A, it was much narrower, but B, I think I understand the French story and the European Union story way better now than I did back then. And I think we had the Germans pretty good, and the British pretty well. But I think I've got the French and European Union story much better. And I think we've got the political economy story much better than we did when we wrote the earlier book.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking, just as you say that, in how many histories of the late Cold War is Jacques Delors a major figure?
Right.
You know,
None.
Who appears? It's well,
Almost. Yeah.
it's one, Philip. And that's really enriching.
Yep. And then there were just some neat, new stories. Like, for instance, in the spring of 1990, which is a period when the crisis is reaching its peak, we point out there was another crisis going on, an ultra secret crisis having to do with the discovery of a vast illegal stockpile of Soviet biological weapons. This is an enormous thing. There is, if you ask, like, how many books about the late Cold War mention the Soviet biological weapons crisis? Again, the answer is one.
Yeah.
And because it was so secret at the time, no one wrote about it in their memoirs. But you know, if you checked with people who did know about it, they would tell you, oh yes, it was incredibly central. And the heads of government are mentioning it in every one of their interactions with the Soviets, but they're just not talking about it or writing things down because it was so explosive. If it had come out publicly, it would have been a thermonuclear explosion in the diplomacy.
So let me ask you to look back a little to the early days in the Bush administration, into which you were brought on board to serve as a Foreign Service officer detailed to the National Security Council staff. And could you just give us a little bit of a sense of what the Bush team's worldview was, how you approached the challenge? Because often histories of the Cold War are sort of ended with Reagan, and then there's sort of the appendix of, and then Bush and company managed not to squander those gains.
Yeah.
And I think that's not the full story. I know that you would agree because that's the story of your book, but I'm always struck by the sense from both sides of the Reagan-Bush transition of the sense that there was a degree of hostile takeover. And I believe, I think it might be Scowcroft who actually says explicitly that.
Yes,
or Bob
right.
Hutchings in his memoirs talks about, you know, thinking that you were succeeding a Republican administration, the filing cabinets would be replete with all the information you needed, and they were bare. So could you give us a little sense of how the Bush team saw the problems of the Cold War as you were coming into office?
Well, in a way, the fundamental realization is that the Cold War was transitioning into something else. But we didn't think the Cold War was over because we didn't think the division of Europe had ended. Now, this is interesting. The Reagan, and let me just start quickly. A lot of this literature tends to fall into Reagan triumph. Did Reagan win the Cold War? Or no, Reagan didn't win the Cold War. Gorbachev is responsible. This is a false binary. It's a highly politicized binary, and a lot of the literature is colored by it. And it's just not very helpful at all. The Reagan-Gorbachev phase is winding up in '88 as everything is moving into a new phase. And Reagan was a Cold Warrior par excellence, an anti-communist par excellence. He was, the great, he was the great missionary of anti-communism. And he played an important historical role. But as the communism is entering a grave systemic crisis, which I think really gets going in 1988, the Reagan people have no plan for what to do about that or how to then work through that, frankly, any more than the Gorbachev people do at that stage, which then plays out into 89. So you find things like Reagan's people are saying the Cold War, and Thatcher is saying the Cold War is over in 1988. In 1988, Reagan secretly tells the Soviet foreign minister, Edward Shevardnadze, he says, you know that speech I gave about tear down that wall? I think that speech was a mistake. I don't know if you even knew Reagan said that to Shevardnadze.
I did. I think I might have heard it from
in September of 88, he says, well, maybe that was a mistake saying tear down that wall. I now understand how sensitive you guys are about Germany and all of that. So they didn't have a vision for what happens in a different Europe. They're thinking as the Cold War is over, if we simply ramp down the tensions and manage and go into permanent rivalry. So Thatcher actually is being left behind with all the new stuff that's happened. But Thatcher is on the same wavelength Reagan was, and she starts getting left behind because you then have this whole completely new series of issues. Now, if I told you that the Bush administration comes in with a secret master plan of how it will all work, no. So I have a whole chapter then in which there are like 5 vectors of change in which the Bush administration starts improvising its settings on each of these vectors during about the first 6 or 8 months of 1989. Like vector is future of European security, future of Germany, future of US-Soviet relations, future of Eastern Europe, future of Western Europe, like do we support economic and monetary union, which is being driven not by us, but by Europeans, but could create the fortress Europe at a time when actually people think protectionism is on the rise, America is becoming an economic nationalist country, and we're worried about a fortress Europe joining fortress Japan as our great rivals. So yes, it was a kind of it was a different takeover because the Reagan administration really had nothing to say about any of these issues very much. There were some individual officials who were very good, but in general, they had no plans for this. They had no pre-existing conception of what to do about now the future of Eastern Europe, the future of Western Europe, and these things. So it all has to be, or Germany at all. In fact, they told us, their leftovers told us don't even talk about the German question. So all that gets pushed out of the way mainly in the spring and summer of '89. Even then, all that does is set the stage for when the crisis really takes off and you have to fashion all the new things. But it positioned us and the West Europeans to basically into a readiness for large-scale change. Where the Bush people are caught off balance is when the democracy movement is crushed in China. There are 2 giant democracy movements underway in sort of the swing states, if you will. One in Europe, one in East Asia. The one in East Asia is crushed in June. And the Bush administration is caught off balance and doesn't really know what to do about that, except to try to somehow hold the relationship with China together at the margins as best it can. So it concentrates and then gets very nervous that, gee, is it going to get crushed in Europe too? And how can we keep that from happening? And then that sets the stage for the incredible developments of '89 and '90, but these are just new issues now.
So let me pick up on the democracy question, because as you are, now from the vantage point of the White House, or I guess across West Executive Avenue and the Eisenhower building, as you're watching all of this unfold, what looked like to you to be the big phenomena at play as you watched these transformations in Europe that culminated in late '89? You talked about the democracy movement, the dissident movement, etc. And we heard a lot from Mary Serrati about a month ago about what that looked like from inside East Germany. It would be great to get your perspective on what that looked like to outside observers. But what about also the political and economic crises that these countries are facing, the kind of the political economy, if you will, of the collapse of communism?
In the first stage, our attention is overwhelmingly focused in 89-90 on the German question, which had been like one of the great perennial questions of international politics, at least since the 1860s. At least since then, if not earlier. So the whole future of Germany, the whole future of German power, how to manage German power if Germany was to be united in some way. So that whole bucket of issues. Then a whole set of issues surrounding the military situation in Europe. Europe at that time, it's hard to remember this now, was the most militarized piece of earth on the planet. And Germany was the most militarized piece of earth in Europe. Germany was unbelievably militarized. There in 1989, there were twice as many tanks in Europe, in Germany, twice as many tanks in Central Europe in 1989 as there were in October 1944. When all the armies were closing in on Germany at the peak, very peak of World War II, only half as many tanks as were there in 89. That's how militarized it was, with thousands of nuclear weapons in there too. And so now you're trying to redesign European security and the German question in the midst of this gigantic conglomeration of military power that you're trying to unwind in the most ambitious arms control agreement ever concluded in human history. To actually regulate every single army from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ural Mountains in a way they'd never been regulated before in history. So that occupied a certain amount of attention. Only later, I would say, then meanwhile, people are beginning, and later in 1990, does the anxiety rise about the future of the Soviet Union itself? And then even later in 90 and 91 about the danger of the implosion of the Soviet Union and the economic issues, to which I must say the Bush administration is struggling to give enough attention because the quality of thought on the economic side was not as good, was not as conditioned. And then at the same time, a whole series of new issues arise, not of the Soviet Union having too much nuclear power, but what happens when all that nuclear power implodes and thousands of nuclear weapons are scattered among a dozen countries. And so it's almost the inverse of the military dangers you had feared in the Cold War, which is a harbinger of the fact that all these new security issues are beginning to emerge that are utterly different from the security issues that dominate geopolitics for the last 2 centuries. They are all the security issues of failure and fragmentation, not the security issues of giant threats.
And as you're thinking about, for example, Germany, what is the debate within the Bush administration as you watch the events of the 9th or the night of the 9th of November unfold about the future? I'm always really curious as a historian about the roads not taken, right? Yep. What were the paths mapped out, but ultimately rejected in favor of what we know happened, which was the unification of Germany. But as the Bush administration watched this happen, what were you thinking were the ways you could go forward in steering American policy and trying to shape, obviously, the policy of other very important actors in the process too?
There's there are a series of intricate decisions that I will not try to unpack in detail because we'll burn up too much time. Because what I'd rather do, and for your students, is I want to notice an overarching theme, which is, I don't know if any of your students have ever actually kayaked on a river or rafted on a river where you're approaching a set of rapids. You're approaching a dangerous situation. And there's one powerful instinct, which is pull to the shore, be super cautious, go through really slow. There's another attitude, which is go straight to the center of the rapids and shoot them as fast as you can, paddling as hard as you can. That's kind of the A-B choice that really, in a way, we faced, is there was a great temptation to slow this down, be really gradual and tentative, because there were all these uncertainties. And there were a lot of people, including the American government, who were worried about doing that. And in our government and the West German government, though, around, I would say, December '89 and into January 1990, there's a decision to just kind of, no, we actually have to hit the gas pedal as hard as we can and basically try to shoot the rapids. Actually, in fact, try to accelerate the process. Make this go as fast as we can possibly make it go in order to outmaneuver the other side, prevent all the possible counterattacks, and basically get this done before people can organize a powerful counterattack. And but that was a risky set of choices, or we thought that was a risky set of choices at the time. But those were the choices the Americans and West Germans decided to make, and we made them work. They might have gone wrong. There were ways things could have gone wrong, even with all these were risky decisions, but they actually, I think, turned out really well. And framed the issue for the East German people when they voted about what future they wanted in March 1990. A vote that actually the West German leader Kohl thought he was going to lose, but in fact he decisively won.
So let me ask you about one aspect of the consequences of that, which is often pointed to or alleged as a failure, and that's Russia. Right. Of course, East Germany is not the only state during this critical presidential term that ceases to be. The other is the Soviet Union. And many people claim that the U.S. policy towards the Soviet Union / Russia was a failure, that effectively Russia was lost in the sense that China was lost in 1949 when Mao and the communists took power. I wonder if you could react a bit to this idea that the US or someone lost Russia, or indeed that Russia was there to be lost in the first place.
Right. Actually, I think it's a really good question, and it hasn't been studied enough, partly because you need to work the economic issues very hard, and many scholars don't do that. And you have to integrate that with the politics, and that's hard. It is a perfectly valid question, which is, could anyone have saved the Soviet economy and thereby saved the Soviet Union? And if an opportunity was lost, where was it lost? And then Russia implodes during the 1990s and is profoundly scarred by that implosion. That's well understood. The issue is, was there any opportunity to keep Russia from imploding and better manage the change? And is the West at fault for screwing it up? And I think actually a lot of that question turns on the period 1992, 1993. And I think it's a valid question. And we went out on a limb in trying to write a lot about this where there's not a lot of good scholarship, and offer our views. But this is an illustration, Simon, of where it's really good to decenter America in order to see America. So what you have to do is ask yourself, if I'm doing the history of the Soviet Union's last days, put America to the side for the moment. Where is there any window to save it? Our argument is there is a window, maybe. Condi partly disagrees with me on this. She kind of half thinks it was insoluble. I think there maybe is a window in August, September of 1990 around something called the Chatelain Plan or the 500-day plan that mostly the Soviets screw up for their reasons we recount. But the United States kind of sees the importance of this window, and preoccupied by the Gulf War and the German unification endgame, doesn't play much of a role one way or another in the story. So I think it's mostly a Soviet story, but the United States doesn't play. Maybe it could have played a much more important role and a more heroic role than it did. On the Russia story, I think if you, again, decenter America, you do the Russian story, what happened with Russia, where are the key decisions. I think that centers a lot, actually, especially in early 92, like the first half of 92. And this is a tight call. I think the International Monetary Fund made one important mistake, but has some other fundamental things right. Bush and Scowcroft are depleted and tired and don't play a super active role. But to his credit, Jim Baker, the Secretary of State, does play a very active role and does pull a lot of things together. My net is that the window was too short, that the Americans are pulling together a pretty substantial Western effort to help. But the Russian window closes too quickly for Russian reasons. In the spring and summer, there was a Russian reformer named Yegor Gaidar, whom I much admire, and I think his work on this period is about right. And they just didn't give Gaidar enough of a chance, and this is partly Yeltsin's fault. But they basically opened up all the purse strings and started spending money freely, which then creates all sorts of bad things happening in the former Soviet Union that make the West's problem almost impossible. But I think it's a close call. There's an argument that I think the West does more than people appreciate, but I don't think it could have done a lot more. One of the bad arguments people make is that the whole screw up is because the West is insisting on privatization. In fact, privatization is not a key part of the economic reform plan that was needed from Russia or the post-communist states. Mostly the advice is not coming from Americans at all. It's mostly coming from Europeans. One of the ironies of the so-called Washington consensus is the Washington consensus that people have heard of actually is not an American view. It's a Latin American view. The Washington consensus was a view of Latin American leaders explaining how they got through their debt crises and forming a consensus program called the Washington Consensus, because the Latin Americans announced it in Washington. But their program, if you read it, doesn't even mention privatization of enterprises. So, but fiscal solvency is really crucial. And controlling the central banking and the financial sector is really crucial. And frankly, Russia then gets that wrong until Putin takes charge. One of the reasons Putin exerts such extreme central power is because Putin is the first Russian leader who really clamped down and got firm control of Russia's finances. And he could only do that actually after Russia's economy effectively collapsed in 1998.
So I'd like to ask you one more question, then I'm going to sick the audience on you. So audience, please go ahead and you can either use the raise hand function in Zoom, or you can chat your questions to Rebecca Dudley and she'll pose them to our guests. But please go ahead and start doing that while I pose my last question, which kind of picks up on the title of the book, To Build a Better World. And I'm always struck when I talk to sort of my friends in government of my generation, that this idea of world building doesnent cross their horizon. The metaphors are mole whacking, firefighting, that it's crisis response.
Yeah.
Right, it's perpetual governance by crisis response, and this is not a phenomenon of the Trump administration. This is equally true of the people I hear from in the Obama administration. So I wonder if you could look back on this time, and to what extent did Secretary Rice, did others, to what extent did you feel that you were building a better world in a big picture, broad horizon sense? And to what extent did it feel at the time that you were responding to crises? The Eastern Europeans are defaulting on debt, loose nukes, et cetera, et cetera. A little perspective on how it felt at the time and how you look back on it now.
The answer is it was constant crisis, but it was actually, there really was a grand strategy emphasis. And quite clearly, I mean, we laid out in speeches, the term Commonwealth of Free Nations was broached in May 1989 and repeated many times after that. Baker explained an overall architecture. So the crises are always being resolved with a broader grand strategic vision in mind. What you're describing, Simon, and you're describing it quite rightly, is the death of the subject on that poster behind you. Because people are so habituated during the last 25 years to basically America's running on autopilot, and all we're doing is just drifting and reacting. And this is not good enough for the 21st century anymore. Because actually our argument is it's time to do another world building project in this generation now for the 2020s. That what we did, I think, a pretty good job in the early 1990s, which was the first big project since the post-World War II project. That built the Cold War order. We built the Global Commonwealth order, which has run into a lot of problems over the last 10 years and is running out of gas. The institutions are running out of gas. The intellectual energy is running out of gas. And the big thing is the 21st century problems are different than the problems of the early 1990s, whether it's biological security, digital security, the security of the global biosphere, other kinds of transnational public order issues. Then you begin thinking about this. If we were building institutions, American priorities, solutions, it's a really deeply different kind of institutional set and outlook than what we've inherited. And our argument is you need to build this peacefully rather than wait for global cataclysms to force you to do things. In other words, this is a time for another round of American grand strategy, but it should be a grand strategy instead of looking backwards saying, hey, we're not going to fight another Iraq war. That's a backward-looking grand strategy. You need to look forward. What are the problems of the 2020s, and how should we organize institutions for them, and then use the current crisis, your reaction, say, to the pandemic right now, or cybersecurity issues, react to the current crises, but react to that in light of a grand strategic perspective about the issues of the age your generation is tackling. Sometimes you'll need new institutions. Sometimes you'll take institutions that have a reassuring shell, but you're going to gut and reinvent their innards so that they're now much more relevant to the new situations, whether that's creating, say, a new coalition of the Technology 10 or Technology 12 to work on digital security issues in a new kind of coalition, or it's completely gutting and revamping NATO, or gutting and revamping the European Union, maybe so they may need to kick more members out rather than just bringing new. It's time to rethink. And time to rethink for the problems of the 2020s. And so in a way, we're describing how we did it in the 1990s, not to encourage nostalgia, to please wind the clock back to that. We're doing that so students can learn better how to think about it in the 2020s.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about, and obviously there are thoughts. I see some hands, and Becca has let me know that she's gathered a few questions as well. But first, I'll give the floor to Phil Ma to pose his question. Phil.
Thank you, Dr. Zelikow, for joining us today. I want to stretch your earlier election metaphor a little further, and was wondering whether you think how soon is the next global election, and who are the candidates? Is it just between the U.S. and China? Is the EU and Russia going to be big players? Could India and Iran even pose threats? And where are the swing states? And what policies is this election going to be over? Is it more economically based rather than ideological? Is it about tech or military or security? Thank you so much.
Phil, it's a great question. And actually, your class is extremely well equipped to answer this. I mean, suppose Simon got all of you together and he has you to put on a blackboard. It's like, what do you think are the main contesting role models for successful governance in the 21st century? And I think basically the binary would be authoritarian technocrats a la China who get things done. You may not like them, but they get things done. Look at the pandemic. Look at black dot, 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 dot. So the China model in a way. Or the model, is there a freedom model? Probably at the moment, no one would say, oh, the freedom model is the United States. They might say it's the countries of the European Union, or maybe some countries in the European Union. Question then is, then ask yourself in the global election of who's choosing between these models, authoritarian technocrats. You could, if you like, have a third model of fascism, revived fascism. And if you think that that's appealing to a lot of people, and then ask yourself, okay, if those are the models, who are the swing states that might actually choose between them? That could actually swing from one camp to another camp. I would actually say quite a lot of Eurasia is swing. Russia, Eastern Europe. I would, a very key question, India. If you had to confidently predict which model India will choose in the next 10 years, I think that's a good question. Or good knows about Pakistan, or a lot of the Muslim world. Or how about if you think there are swing states that will determine the direction of Africa, pick out which ones you think those are. Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt. So you see what I mean? I think if you basically put on a blackboard, what are the rival models? If you're picking the high school cafeteria tables, okay, and there are the three groups of kids at the three tables, and you can put a label on each table, the boho kids, et cetera, right? And then you ask yourself, all right, who are the kids standing at the doorway of the cafeteria who haven't made up their mind yet which table they want to sit at 10 years from now? And which of those are the most important countries? I think you could run that exercise and come up with some pretty interesting answers.
Well, we're running a version of it tomorrow morning in my American Grand Strategy seminar, actually, which Phil is a student in. So now Phil's got some good ideas to get started. I want to turn to Rebecca Dudley, who's going to pose a question on behalf of Sarah Scanlon, who's having some technical difficulties.
Hi, so Sarah's question is related to the pandemic. So she's wondering how, if you can provide your perspective on how the pandemic has shifted and impacted the international power and security dynamic. And in particular, has the management of the pandemic and the policy during it increased the shift toward a multipolar world rather than a bipolar or US hegemonic world?
Well, see, I think the US hegemonic world has been already gone for a while. I never believed in it. I never believed in it in the early 1990s. We have a little thing in our book where Condi doesn't believe in it either. We have a little section in our book that we call the unipolar mirage. And we say that, Krauthammer writes his famous piece in late 1990 calling the unipolar moment. We don't think there was a unipolar moment even then. But a lot of Americans convinced themselves they were in one. They convinced themselves that they were dominant and they could really arrange the world. This was Icarus trying to fly. And Icarus basically really gets going in the late 1990s, I would say circa 1997 or so, really begins to get full of himself and takes off. And it takes him about 10 years to hit the ground really hard. But America has not been, I think Icarus hits the ground hard and bounces a couple of times around 2006, for sure by 2006. And then of course comes the financial crisis, bang, 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 financial crisis on top of that. So anyone who thought that we were a hegemon should have been disillusioned about that a long time ago, more than 10 years ago. So it's multipolar now, and only people who believe America is the overarching villain, or people who don't know much about the world still believe America has hegemonic power. So now the issue is, what role does America play in a multipolar world, and in the pandemic? And actually, at the moment, of course, under the Trump administration, the answer is about as much as any inert mass. So it's going to become a somewhat less inert mass next year. God willing, and the creek don't rise, as we used to say back home in the holler. And if you can get an active American role, it's clearly not something we can do on our own. I think if people look to examples in the pandemic, probably the standouts are Germany and some of Europe. Germany probably above all. I think a lot of the world is not looking to China as the model. Partly because they think the pandemic is partly China's fault, rightly or wrongly. That's a widespread view. And if anything, they're more attracted by Taiwan and South Korea. There's a lot of soft power in East Asia, but it's not necessarily Chinese soft power. It's in these other areas like Taiwan and South Korea, which is one of the things that makes the Chinese so nervous, because they don't like the fact that everyone admires Taiwan so much. So the pandemic underscores multipolarity, but I don't think it's done a lot yet to damage the United States even more. It's clearly, we're now going to have to rejoin the story in some constructive way, but it's going to be in complex partnerships. And in a way, but to decenter America, look at the problem you want to solve. Pick whatever problem interests you. Look at that problem, then ask yourself, in solving that, how does that problem get solved? Then ask yourself, what role does America play in such a solution?
Let's turn now to David Schanzer.
Hi, Professor Zelikow. Thank you so much for being here. I think my question builds on the discussion you've been having so far in the last couple of questions. So you discuss how we built the post-Cold War order, or it was built, not by us, but it was already a bit multipolar. But in that particular historical moment, Russia, of course, was very weak, and China had not emerged.
Right.
Now you're talking about reconstituting a new global order where clearly China is much, much stronger, and Russia is just different. So in creating these institutions, either China's going to have a say. So either you're talking about, as you said, kind of separate institutions that are competing, one on a freedom model and one on an authoritarian kind of technocrat model, which doesn't sound like very effective at solving global problems, which any global problem that China is not participating in the institution that is solving it, is actually competing, is going to be very hard to solve. All the ones you listed, China is deeply involved in, is either the big part of the problem or necessary to come about a solution. So then you're looking at some sort of negotiated kinds of institutions, and I'm wondering how possible or effective those might be. So I'm wondering if you could opine on that. How do you, in this very multipolar world, but with two big poles, the US and China, how do you create effective institutions when we have such different views of the world and we're really competing over these different models for solutions?
And it's a great question. My main answer to that is you have to work it issue by issue. So there are three schematics. Schematic one is multipolar law of the jungle, in which China then becomes its own global empire, kind of on the British Empire model, controlling infrastructure and finances and things like that. Multipolar rivalry, anarchic, in which global problems mostly are not solved, because that is not a system of world order, that's just a system for world competition. Second model is basically new Cold War or new kind of Versailles system that has inners and outers, in which, like, League of Democracies here, villains there. There are clearly people who are on the outs, and we try to make it work only with kindred states. I think, or that's another version. I think that's also a prescription for failure on most issues. And it also helps to create a lot of new dangers that are not yet necessary. A third approach, unless you've given up on cooperation and world order, is the one you imply, which is on some issues, you basically form functional coalitions based on who do I need to get together to actually do stuff on this. So let me give you an illustration. Global biosphere, I think, as you know, it's going to be very hard to come up with solutions that don't involve China. And actually, China shares an interest in a lot of the global biosphere issues, including the management of the oceans, though there we have a lot of differences because China is playing a somewhat predatory role in the oceans. But anyway, I think you have to be open to working with China and Russia on issues of the global biosphere. But what about digital security and cybersecurity? There, actually, I think it's probably not either necessary, nor am I very hopeful about including China in your functional coalition. I think instead, I'm more drawn to ideas like a technology 10 or technology 12 sort of coalition, because I think China's fundamental political approach is just going to be antithetical to the kind of vision of digital security and digital openness that we and the Europeans and the Australians and some of the East Asians are going to treasure. On biological security, maybe more cooperation possible. So unless you give up on cooperation altogether and you just think it's anarchy and rivalry, which I have not given up on, I don't accept that, or you think I can organize everything around bipolar world and Cold War style world, which I don't believe I believe that is a prescription to make things worse. I think then you're in the third basic approach, which is to run this in a very practical way, issue by issue, asking yourself, what results do I want and who do I need on my team to get those results?
So I'm mindful of our clock ticking down, but I also see that there's some more questions. So what I'm going to propose is that we collect them, Philip, that we collect the questions and then you kind of answer as you will. So I'm going to start with the live questions first from Bren Potter.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. I appreciate it. I had a question about advice for grad students. The relevancy of Russia today and global security landscape. I'm imagining that political science students and defense professionals who were learning Russian in 1989 became very disappointed with their relevance very quickly as the world shifted its focus. I wanted to know what you make of the utility of studying Russia for a grad student today, Russian history, defense analysis, the language, etc.
Thanks, Bren. Let's get Asa Royal in here.
Sure, thanks. Hi, Dr. Zelikow. I was reading Svetlana Alexievich's oral history that followed the Soviet Union, and in it, I know you mentioned Gaidar. He seemed like a figure that was reviled by a lot of people in Russia.
Yep.
So I'm curious why you say that you admire him, and whether you think that the views that are in that book paint an accurate picture of many Russians.
And then finally, Rebecca will read the question of Graham Wood, who is also having a technical difficulty issue. And then we'll see how you can splice those together, Philip. But Rebecca.
Hello?
Oh, Graham Wood has a question. Okay, great. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I realized I can, my mic's working. So my question is, I've been reading a book called The 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury, a leading figure on the Trump administration on China. And so in the quest to deal with and counter the Soviet Union, the US made the conscious choice to provide aid, military, scientific, etc., to the People's Republic of China. Do you think the US inconsequently created a greater challenge to the free world compared to the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 90s?
So three very small questions dealing with the very, very basic countries of Russia and China. Philip, can I ask you to respond to the questions posed?
Let me take them in inverted order a little bit. Let me just. I just don't accept Pillsbury's argument about China, that American aid to China made China a powerful country. That's just not. Now, what the Chinese did, very much like what the Japanese did in the 19th century during the Meiji era, and actually what Americans did, copying Britain and Germany sometimes, and in fact, sometimes stealing British technology illicitly, like torpedo designs in the late 1800s and early 1900s, is the Chinese aggressively sought out what they thought were best practices around the world in a variety of things, and then made their own decisions as to what they were going to do to adapt those to Chinese ways and to use foreign know-how in their way. But as far as the United States government giving military assistance or other kinds of assistance that then empowered and enabled China's rise, I don't think that argument's going to hold up as a good reading of modern Chinese history. But I know where Pillsbury is going with that argument, and I know Michael, and I just don't agree with it. The Gaidar point is a really interesting one. The questioner was referring to a wonderful collection of oral histories by a magnificent oral historian named Svetlana Alexievich, who also has done a good oral history of the World War II era in the Soviet Union. And what she encounters is a ton of people who are really mad at Gaidar. And what happened is, because Russia imploded and because the reform movement was seen as associated with the horrible implosion and all the hardships people endured, words like market, capitalism, democracy became practically curse words. They became the kind of words you'd spit out as an epithet. And Gaidar was the kind of symbol of all, like, he put in all those market reforms and look at our country's turned to crap. That's the popular image of Gaidar. The question is whether or not that's true, substantively true. We make an argument in the book that, which I believe, and I cite various sources, but I don't think Gaidar is to blame for the failure of reform. The reform Gaidar wanted to carry out was not carried out in Russia. Instead, the revolution was hijacked by a corrupt elite who rigged a system of partial reform that they could then use to arbitrage extremely large profits from the remains of the old state sector with partial privatizations and partial liberalizations in order to create fantastic opportunities for organized crime and corruption. What we call the world of partial reform. The world of partial reform, which happened in a lot of the post-communist societies, is the worst of all possible worlds. We argue that the only cure for the partial reform viciousness was actually to go all the way into radical reform, which to do that, you actually had to eliminate the state subsidies and state-controlled prices that were the sources of all the arbitrage and criminal profits, currency regulations and other things. But the people blame Gaidar, but in truth, I think Gaidar is not to blame and is actually a somewhat tragic and heroic figure. if properly. Anyway, that's our view. And this really brings me to the first question: should I study Russia? If you thought the answer I just gave to the last question was interesting, then in a way your question is answered. Because one reason to study Russia is such a great and fearsome power that we must study it because it's going to drive world history. How about another answer? You study Russian history for some of the same reasons you might study Japanese history, or German history, or even American history, or British history. Because in a way, it's this fascinating, complex, and extraordinary set of experiments in how to organize human society that have had successes and tragic failures, but present the whole spectrum of human choices and possibilities in all sorts of situations of stress. To me, I find histories like that full of interest and full of information and sources of insight. And so I think someone who chooses to study Russian history is therefore studying an absolutely fantastically rich dish of ideas and information that should give you the same insight that studying any great nation's history can yield.
Well, on that note, perhaps I couldn't have put better myself, the importance of history, which is the entire theme of this speaker series. It remains only for me to say thank you, Philip, for making the time to be here with us this evening, to remind everyone that To Build a Better World is available wherever fine books are sold, and encourage you to read this fascinating account, not only of an important episode in history with a lot of possibilities, but also with really strong and clear echoes in today. And I think that's what's so wonderful about this book, is that you give us as much to think about when it comes to the past as you do for the present and the future.
And it's available in paperback.
It is available. I see. I've got the hard copy, and I hope many of you will pick it up soon. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Philip, thank you for coming, and I wish everyone a good evening and great evening. And we are adjourned.
Thank you, Simon, and thanks to all of you.